I'll tell you three little stories. One is about the environment that I walked into when I graduated from the University of Adelaide and how that led into the early days of the internet that these days is in our pockets, but when I graduated didn't actually exist. How that led to starting a little company that I started here in Adelaide and kind of where things have gone since. So just a little bit of a memory lane from when I graduated through to now. And it's pictures, right? One of the things that you don't want to do in this sort of stuff is knock people off with too much text. But we'll start with this though. 1986, that was the year that I was like the younger cohort here. I was a graduate of the University of Adelaide. And I got that joy of stepping across the stage in my lovely black gown, and I received a Bachelor of Science in Applied Mathematics. I was very keen to do a computer science degree, but in 1986 the computer science degree did not exist. The computers were around, and here's me as that recent graduate, wandered into the computer room that then existed. Back in 1986, so I did a computer science course, to be clear. So the computer science department existed, but it wasn't yet to that marvellous stage of having lots of awards available to it and being a direct discipline you could have a degree in. That enormous box behind me is a digital VAX VMS computer. It's what we used as students. That computer's probably got about, so it's the size of 3 or 4 fridges. It's probably got substantially less computing power than that watch. It had 3.75 megabytes of memory, and we had about 60 students using it at once. So I have an opinion about the efficiency of computer software, which is you can write extremely efficient software. In the modern world, you don't have quite such an incentive to fit stuff in that little amount of storage. But I'd happily become a student writing software on those things. While I was a student, I was also messing about writing industrial machine tool software in my spare time. That's me fiddling with a device that I've written the software for. And that led to a situation where, while I was sort of doing that consulting work while I was a student, once I graduated, the university actually had some job ads for system administrators. And I applied for a job as a system administrator at the University of Adelaide. And in 1987, I went to my first and only job interview, and amazingly, I succeeded in it. So this is yours truly, at the ripe old age of 22, in an office in the bowels of the Bar Smith building. I had a window, but it was a window to another office. And you can see that I wasn't entirely clean about operating my desk at the time. I had a home office where I'd keep working on bits of software, and that was actually even more messy. And there's an Apple II on the right, and the thing in the middle is actually an example of what the computer science department used when I was a student. It's a Sun workstation, a Sun II workstation. A remarkably nifty beast. So Unix has been around an awful long time. So it brings me to the first story, which is about the evolution of the internet in Australia, about a thing called ARMNet, a little company called TGV, and an internet toaster. So when I was a student and then a graduate, as I said, there was no internet. And once I started working at the uni, I was at the right place at the right time, because that was when the universities in Australia knew about this internet thing, because it was in America, and the universities got together and did something very brave, because the government didn't understand what that was. The Vice Chancellor's Committees of the universities agreed to take a slice out of their collective budget and build the Australian version of the internet. So the Australian Academic and Research Network, ARNet, a ridiculous name that was a placeholder that no one ever replaced, came into existence. These two fine gentlemen led a team of technologists around the country, myself being one of them, to build that first version of the internet, to hook network connections up between state capitals and between universities in each state at the massive speed of 2 megabits per second, these various connections. And a very thin connection was placed off to the US, and we were all very happy little geeks. That big computer you saw me standing in front of as a graduate, there wasn't internet connection software for those computers because there wasn't internet. So someone had to invent that software. And a little company called TGV, which stood for Two Guys in a VAX, remember that thing's a VAX, had written that software, and they got wind of the fact that we were building the internet in Australia. And they sold their very expensive but very nifty software to all the unis. And I got to know the guys, and we wound up having a couple of drinks after dinner one night and hatched this silly thought, which is, what do you get if you cross industrial machine tool control with computer networking? What you get is an internet toaster. This is literally the first internet toaster that ever got built. Really, in effect, the first IoT gadget, right? In 2025, we all understand the IoT thing, right? You get an Internet of Things object. You go down to Harvey Norman or Bunnings and buy a blob that does something. The late 1980s, they didn't exist. Didn't realise we were actually creating one. And the TGV guys said to me, as a 22-year-old working at Adelaide Uni with my great little job administering these computers, that if I could make that toaster work over the internet in 3 months, they'd fly me to America to show it to people at a trade show. And this was very exciting for me as a recent graduate to go and do that. So darn it, I did that. I sat in that messy home office, and then 3 months later I found myself in Las Vegas demonstrating how you can burn the bread at a distance. Ta-da! And apropos of the conversation we had earlier, I was wearing a tie. It was wrapped around that t-shirt, but there was a tie. So I had the fun of doing that. The guys in the booth next door to us at the trade show actually jimmied up this thing, which is a Lego gantry for loading and unloading the bread out of the toaster, also computer controlled over the network. And at that point in time, I had substantially more hair. That's me on the right, looking like Billy Connolly. And I had a ball doing that, again, as a young university student and then a young university graduate, getting to suddenly be in America, but playing with these exciting people. The next year, I took a few months leave of absence from my university job, and I wound up back in California because we decided to up the ante. What we did with this thing was we decided we were going to connect a stereo system to the internet. So that's an AM/FM tuner and a CD player, and control it with a little magic box that we needed to make and send the sound back over the internet. Doesn't that sound like an impressively unexciting thing to do in 2025, when that's the only way any of us listen to music? But there's always an antecedent, there's always something that comes first, right? We had to write all the software for this, we wrote the user interface for this, we left a radio tuner in Australia, and I flew back to California, and we were running that tuner in California, and people could listen to the cricket coming from Australia live. They didn't believe it was really happening until we unplugged the network jack from the back of the thing and the sound stopped. But the thing that wasn't obvious to people on the show floor was that the Australian internet connection was still so thin that when I was playing the cricket over this, I was using the entire internet link between Australia and the US. So when Simon was demonstrating his lovely CD player tuner, no email for you. It was, so we claim relative credit for being one of the first. This is one of the first times that we know of that audio was sent over the internet as something that was actually a bright new idea. It was great fun. The TGV guys even got a cartoonist to make a cartoon about it. So this is me, right? And the caption says, "In a display of perverse brilliance, Simon the repairman mistakes a compact disc player for a workstation assistant unit, but manages to tie it to the network anyway." Had a ball. Having done that stuff for a few years, I started getting delusions of grandeur about starting a company. TGV, the people that made that internet software, offered me a job in America, and I surprised them by turning it down, and instead I started a little company called Internode here in Adelaide. I had this strange bee in my bonnet about starting a company. Internode stands for an internet node, a device on a network. And the idea was to commercialise those gadgets, but I was 20 years too early. And so in that way that often happens in the world, other things happen while you're busy making those plans. So I rented an office in the back of a real estate agent in Goodwood Road, and we started working on that internet gadget, but as I said, we never quite got there. What we did do, we came up with a business card. Another student friend of mine designed this business card for Internode Systems. This is the shortest lived business card in corporate history because you see there's an I and an S, right? That there in the middle for Internode Systems. The first business person I walked up to and handed this card to, he looked at it and said, "That's a bong." So that's now a historical artefact. It went away really quick. TGV, that company that made that expensive software, they were kind enough, after I turned them down, to hand me the distribution and sales and support rights for their software in Australia. So we made some good pocket money selling that software to companies. And we spent the money buying a whole lot of gadgets and putting them in a room like this, because what I realised was a fun thing to do was to take that internet that I had the fun of being a part of creating and start to sell it to other people. So here's yours truly in 1991, and that rack, the top left-hand side of that, the little red flashing lights, those are dial-up modems. Some of you have heard of those. The older people in the room have heard of dial-up modems and used them. The younger people in the room must wonder what the hell they are. It was strange mating calls sent over a fixed line to get you to the internet, but very, very slowly. And here's yours truly with somewhat less hair, still a very messy office, getting on with doing that. That was actually quite successful. Between 1994 and the year 2000, we signed up about 10,000 South Australians who would dial up of an evening and get their email. And we were so successful, we had to move into a big building. This is the building above Jasmine's restaurant in Hindmarsh Square. And at our peak, we occupied everything above the ground floor of that place. We ate Jasmine's out of house and home because there were 200 phone support people in the building who would go downstairs and get a takeaway. So that worked quite well. Year 2000 was when broadband internet came to Australia, and that was using those same copper phone lines, but wringing every last bit of capacity out of them with a mysterious thing called ADSL2+. And the point about that was, companies like mine would plug this sort of gadget into a Telstra phone exchange, and as I said, would wring enormous capacity out of that line. And so rather than getting tiny amounts of speed, you got a whopping 20 megabits per second out of the copper phone line. Every time someone connected with us, a Telstra technician would have to physically connect their phone line to that box, which means there were an awful lot of wires out the back of that rack. Right? It's kind of remarkable it worked at all. But it really did work. And for a company that had spent 6 years signing up 10,000 people, from the year 2000 to about 2010, we signed up 200,000 people. And the peak of that, we were connecting about 8,000 people a month, so we needed an even bigger office. That's on the other side of Hindmarsh Square. We kind of like the East End. And that sign stayed there for a remarkably long period of time. And we suddenly got to be a proper, serious business with lots of people in it and nice logos, and we sold nice mugs, like a fine variety of mugs. I'd just like to give you a brief sense of how far the capacity of internet connections has gone in that period of time. This is a diagram, and you're not expected to be able to read the text, from 2004. In 2004, we built a national computer network with 100 megabit per second connections between state capitals. That was what all these dial-up customers and then broadband customers used. 10 years later, 2015, that diagram that you also can't really see the detail of was the global network we had built by mid-2015. And those connections going under the water on optical fibre were running at 100 gigabits per second. The point being, in that 10 years, the speed of the network had gone up by a factor of 1,000. It's the classic kind of Moore's Law thing, but it's really still impressive to me to think about just how fast that's just progressed, and it hasn't stopped. Indeed, ARNet, that network I was a part of originally building, still exists. The university sector still run what is today one of the most leading edge networks in the world. They continue to do that, which is entirely appropriate. Australian academic and research network. The research is about networking. You know, it's a really sensible thing to do. My little company succeeded, and it had no business plan, no marketing budget, but what we were very keen about was doing a great job. So what we used to do was win customer satisfaction awards. It's a set of customer satisfaction numbers, again, you can't read from a distance, but we're at the top of it. We had about 95% customer satisfaction on surveys. Telstra was sitting at about 65%. They're the one that's the furthest to the left in that picture. And that was the fun at the time, right? We started in a world where Telstra had all the customers, and plucky little competitors like us, our job was to nibble them away, and we enjoyed that job greatly. The other thing I'll briefly mention about the Internode days is we did some stuff in regional Australia as well. And this is an us versus them photograph. The tower on the left is a big Telstra communication tower. This one's at Tailem Bend. We spent a fair bit of time and effort building regional communication networks in South Australia, just because we wanted to. So that little tower on the right is our competitive tower, sending internet data alongside all of the boring circuit switch stuff going on in the Telstra tower on the left. So we enjoyed the David versus Goliath thing. So there's that little story. The next little story is about electric cars. 2006, in the midst of all of that stuff, I met a guy at a trade show in America, a conference in America, a guy called Elon Musk. You might have heard of him. Back in 2006, he was a plucky, interesting, introverted geek who wasn't at all full of himself. Things have changed, but he really was quite that. And the joy I had a few years earlier is driving an amazing vehicle that's almost mythical now in America. In 1999, there was a thing called the GM EV1. This is the world's first half-decent electric car. GM built it, and then 3 or 4 years later took them all back and crushed them. If you want to know why, there's an old doco called Who Killed the Electric Car that'll explain that to you. But I got to drive one of those things, and I was hooked on the idea of electric cars. It wasn't because I was going to save the planet driving one, it's because they were the future. And so when Elon was saying at this conference, we're building this cool little sports car called a Tesla Roadster, I immediately ordered one. And that's it. That was number 186 ever built of Tesla Roadsters. I ordered that thing. That is it strapped to a base because it was flown out to Australia in the belly of a 747. Because the guys who run the car race here in Adelaide got wind of my having ordered it. They paid to fly it out. So I don't know the answer to the question, what does it cost to fly a car across the planet? Because someone else did it. But it came out just a few days before the race that year. And here's my now 17-year-old son deciding he wanted to drive it first. Clearly was slightly younger there. But the first time I got to drive that car at 200 k's an hour was running around Adelaide streets, quite legally, but on a racetrack. But here's the trouble, right? I was so enthusiastic to buy the first decent electric car I could buy in Australia that I ignored the fact that it was left-hand drive with Californian number plates. And that's not something you can legally drive in Australia. So the best I could do was wind up with magazine articles like this, the caption of which says, Australia's biggest internet geeks bought the first Tesla, but he can't even drive it. I could run it at racetracks. What I did do was I wound up organising to drive it alongside the solar cars from Darwin to Adelaide. So that's me doing that. And I wanted to prove a point. I wanted to prove that electric cars could drive from Darwin to Adelaide like it was normal. You need to appreciate at the time no one had done that. And so there was this belief that electric cars weren't going to cut it, and I wanted to prove them wrong, and I did. The only slight challenge was there was no charging infrastructure. So I had some buddies that followed me down the road in a truck with a 3-phase genset on the back. So I had mobile charging, right? Took it down. But chicken and egg, right? So I borrowed a chicken and I drove an egg. That worked. Back at the ranch though, about 2011, I'd reached the point where it was time to sell Internode for various reasons, and that's me, obviously, and the other guy is a man called Michael Malone, who started a company called iNet that existed for about the same period of time as Internode. He listed that company, and I had a long-running conversation with him, which was Internode wasn't for sale, but if I ever changed my mind, it'd be him I'd sell it to. So one day I did, and that was a big day. But wound up on the board of iNet after that and had the fun of helping to steer a company that collectively had 1 million customers. And just thinking about the IT systems involved in handling a 1 million customer organisation was really quite a hoot to do that. Really very much enjoyed it. But it was a huge transition for me, which gets me to kind of where things have got to now. One of the things that did happen, I had never imagined that I'd be that financially successful. It was a very successful transaction. Not something I'd ever believe would happen when I started the company. So we did actually buy a few things. We bought a lovely office, and it's only about 400 metres up the road from here in Kent Town, called Base 64. If you're an old enough geek, you might appreciate that Base 64 is the encoding mechanism for attachments in emails. But it's also 64 North Terrace, so I couldn't resist the joke. The font is Courier, which also makes sense to some people that are old enough. We bought a farm in Tasmania because my wife Anna, who's here, and I are very keen about Tasmania, and so we bought this lovely farm. And one of the other things I'm very keen about is flying things. I actually joined the University of Adelaide Gliding Club when I was a student, and that got me hooked on flying things. And I've been flying gliders and powered aircraft ever since. And so bought a nice plane to be able to fly back and forth between Adelaide and the Vale at the place in Tasmania and elsewhere. So that was my real indulgence, was buying the plane I always wanted. That's a lovely beast. But down there as well, since there's a runway on the property, I do keep flying those gliders. So that's a big beastie, a thing called a Stemmer S10 VT glider that I very much enjoy flying. I was doing something called wave soaring in that thing just last week up there. Lots of fun. So there's that. Last but not least, the passion that the EV led to and the technology led to, which is renewable energy. The other thing I've done in the last decade was investing in renewable energy companies of various sorts. And there's a company I invested in called Redflow that make a really, really cool battery called a zinc bromine flow battery. which is lovely because it lasts for ages and it can't cause a fire, and it's got lots of interesting Australian technology in it, and I put a whole lot of them in my office at Base 64 up the road. But unfortunately, it was still a startup, and notwithstanding that I put 10 years worth of time, an awful lot of money, and even ran it for a year, it didn't succeed. About a year ago, it actually finally ran out of shareholder capacity to support it, and it's fallen on its shoelaces, which is a pity. And it's reminded me that passion is marvellous, but sometimes things don't always succeed. That one didn't. However, the renewable energy stuff, that's really become the big passion for me in the last 10 years. And there's a big solar array at the farm, 200 kilowatt solar array, and an awful lot of batteries. There's 400 kilowatt hours of batteries sitting down there at the farm. And I really like playing in this stuff. And what I do as a day job these days is I couldn't help it. I started a little company writing software. I'm back to writing software again, which is something I always used to like doing, to control energy flows in buildings, to make energy flows more efficient in buildings. So that's been really quite a big ride, and hopefully that's been at least amusing to you to see a little bit of a slideshow of what happened between 1986 and now to little old me. I would say to those of you that have graduated today, I hope that your journey is just as interesting. I've been enormously fortunate, as you can see, to have a very interesting journey. This is just a tiny glimpse of it, but go out there and find your own North Stars. Go out there and do something interesting with the skills that you've built up. The world's your oyster, and in 40 years' time, it won't look like this. It will have changed in some interesting way. When I started out, these gadgets we've all got in our pockets didn't exist, of course, and I don't know what gadgets we'll have in our pocket in 40 years' time. We'll probably have them in our brains instead, but we know it will have shifted a lot. And thank you, as the last thought, to the university for being kind enough to award me an honorary doctorate last year. I was incredibly chuffed about that. And it's left me with a fabulous souvenir, which is I've got this great gown that I can take to the dog park on Fridays to really wow the troops, right? If you want to stand out on a Friday drink to the dog park, doctorate gown. That's the thing to use. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have enjoyed the chat.